Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from cold North Germany, and I would much rather be where my guest today is located in southern Florida. But I also don't like hurricane country, so I'll stick to the cold for now. I'm very happy that and this is a very special episode, is the 50th episode of the podcast. So a little moment of celebration here for us. And I'm extraordinarily happy that I get a really interesting book for this opportunity. I have today with me as my guest, Dr. Sarah Rodríguez. She is a assistant professor at Florida Gulf Coast University with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And we are going to talk about a really interesting book, and I'm not even sure how we're going to cover all of, or even a glimpse of all the things that she has done with this book, which is One National Family, Texas, Mexico, and the Making of the Modern United States, 1820 to 1867, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So, Sarah, thank you on this nice Saturday for you for joining me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And as usual, I really like to get to know a little bit about you have a extremely interesting book in that you're taking Texas, but you're placing it juxtaposition wise between Mexico and the United States. So you're effectively looking at three countries in the span over the span of almost 50 years, which is a phenomenal undertaking. So how did you decide to do that much?
Um, well, I got interested in specifically in Texas history as a graduate student at Penn. I'm trained as a 19th century U.S. historian. I was specifically interested in the South, but I entered the field at a time when Western history and borderlands history was
Mm,
really taking off. We had really field transforming books by folks like Brian DeLay, Eric
mhm,
Hellman, Pekka Hamalainen, and I just really enjoyed those books. I mean, they just really opened
mm,
my eyes, and the sort of the interpretive framework that they were using, the new perspectives that they were bringing to the field. Um, got interested in Texas specifically as I was sort of perusing the Austin papers, the Stephen F. Austin papers, which are
mm,
published and readily available. And I was sort of surprised to find that they were rife with these declarations of loyalty and fealty to
mm,
Mexico. And I was sort of surprised by that because I had always been taught this conventional narrative of,
mm,
these settlers, these US settlers went into Mexican Texas. They were really only interested in cheap land
mm,
and they wanted to break away and become an independent republic as soon as they could. So I was sort of intrigued by these testaments of fealty to Mexico, and I wasn't convinced by that narrative.
mm,
I got a lot of training out of the McNeil Center at the University of Pennsylvania at a time when early Americanists were really starting to reconsider U.S. strength and nationalism during this
mm,
period. Kathleen Duvall's work,
mhm,
Independence Lost, was really transformative for me. So I knew that people, in the Trans-Mississippi West during this time were between like 1790 and 1820, were really disillusioned with the United States. And I also knew that there was, a pattern of both white settlers and native groups attaching themselves to different powers,
mm,
right? Aligning themselves with whether they were European or Republican powers. So to me, it kind of, made sense. I mean, I was surprised by it, but it also made sense that these testaments might actually be sincere, right?
mm,
That these people might genuinely be interested in becoming Mexican citizens and the Mexican political process. So I sort of started to dig a little bit deeper into that. And I soon realized that if I wanted to write a sort of new history of Texas that reconsidered these people's relationship to Mexico, their motivations for going there, that I would have to also look at the United States and Mexico and sort of reconsider these two nations
Mm,
during this period and what exactly was pushing these settlers, what in the United States, what factors in the US were pushing them towards Mexico, and what factors in Mexico were drawing them to that country. So that's how it sort of, a history, a supposedly revisionist history of Texas sort of ultimately became a kind of revisionist comparative political
mm.
history of these two countries' early nation building experiences.
Like their last sentence is already like packed with like ideas of where we could go with all of this. Like but I'm still stuck on like how is a person in Pennsylvania getting interested in Texas? Like I've lived near Texas. It's not that like maybe proximity is like where you get like jaded by the state.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Southern California.
Oh,
So,
okay. Where about?
yeah, yeah. Pasadena, Altadena area,
Okay.
actually.
My wife's from
Um,
the Redondo Beach, LA area.
okay, yeah.
We were just there
So
actually.
yes, yeah. So Texas, is different, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I was born, raised, educated in California. I went back east, first to Vassar and then to Penn for my education. And then I was primarily interested in the US and studying the US South.
Mm,
Um, I also, I think, as somebody who was, born and raised in California, whose my mother's ancestor, or my grandparents were from Arkansas and Texas. My
okay.
father's family is from Mexico and Guatemala. The American Northeast always seemed kind of exceptional to me. The
Mm,
rest of the continent, the South, the West, Latin America, they all seemed kind of similar,
mm,
right? Agrarian, at least during the 19th century, right? I mean, I don't know that I would say that anymore, but agrarian, hierarchical,
mm,
those sorts of things. So I was sort of intrigued to sort of think of Texas as kind of the nexus of
mm,
this kind of larger sort of agro-republican emerging vision during the 19th century. I also, I entered the field at a time when my advisors, Steve Hahn and Stephanie McCurry,
mm,
were thinking about the South, relationships between the
mm,
South and the West, right? And so you wouldn't think of it, but Penn sort of became a hub for a lot of folks who were grad students during that time, sort of rethinking the American West, right? And sort of how to better contextualize it within the national histories of the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So even though we think of Texas as somewhat, and it has been traditionally, right? Texas history written by
mm,
Texans, mostly about Texas, right? I entered the field at a time when people were really starting to sort of break out of those
mhm.
boundaries and think a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's but it's curious how like, like I mean
Hmm.
it's you go to a place and you think, oh, somebody would study that region more so, or like they have some personal connection to it, and like, but no, good. So, but the other part I kind of I'm curious about because it probably was something similar for you maybe that I encountered a lot that when you do sort of this comparative study, a lot of times committees, when you're looking for jobs, they don't know what to do with you. Are you a Mexican historian? Are you a Texan historian? Are you a U.S. historian? Are you political, intellectual? What are you?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I'm not asking you what you are, but I'm kind of curious if you had sort of similar issues where you kind of were like, they just I could apply for different places, but they never took me serious because I'm a little bit of everything.
Um, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I've pitched myself I don't really consider myself a Texas historian. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I obviously I'm a historian of Texas, but I don't really like to limit myself that much. I mean, I usually sort of categorize myself as, U.S. Mexico borderlands and
Mm-hmm.
comparative historian, comparative political historian. Although now I've become more interested in Canada, so now I might just say, now I typically just say 19th century North American, politics and sovereignty.
Right.
Um, but you're right. It's difficult to sometimes place you, and even as the project sort of evolved, I had a hard time with how to pitch it or
Hmm.
how to explain it. I was like, well, it's this sort of, new history of Texas, but it's also, a comparative history of the United States and Mexico. And it's kind of, I mean, in some ways, I feel like it almost could have been two books.
Hmm.
It's as you know, it's divided into two different parts, and
Hmm.
the first part is mostly focused on Texas. The latter part mostly focused on the U.S. and Mexico. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky thing. But then it also, I mean, in another respect, it makes total sense, right?
Hmm.
That any
Yeah,
good like thorough history of Texas would also need to be a history of
yeah.
the United States and Mexico,
Yeah.
right? Especially when you consider that its relationship with both countries was pretty similar
Hmm.
and all of that. So yeah.
No, I totally agree. I mean, that's exactly what what if you want to do Texas right, you have to have both sides in there. It's just
Mhm.
they're sitting right in the middle between two big blocks pulling on them in various directions. It's like,
Mhm.
that is, but I guess that sort of the other part that sort of makes this more challenging is that you're looking at sources out of Texas, you're looking at sources out of the United States, some Southern politicians, you have New Orleans in a few places, sort of the Southern expansionist mind frame, you have Mexico with its political instability. So how challenging is that?
It's challenging for sure. I mean, one of the great, well, there are sort of several big challenges, I think, of doing any kind of comparative history, right? Or transnational history, right? The first one being that you really have to be an expert
Hmm.
in, the histories of multiple places, right? And I really had to educate myself in early Mexican history, which was no, I was not trained in that field, right? I had to educate myself in a lot of Texas history, um,
Hmm.
which is no easy feat, right? Anybody who knows the early period of Mexico and how and how sort of politically unstable it is, right? It can be very challenging. So that was sort of the first challenge. Um, and then of course, the next big one is, that you have to be able to conduct research usually in multiple languages and in multiple countries.
Yes.
Um, so the project, in addition to sort of educating myself on early Mexican history, I also had to brush up on my Spanish language skills, which fortunately I
Hmm.
already had a good sort of basis for that. I spent one summer at Middlebury's immersive language program to brush up on my Spanish reading and writing and speaking skills. Fortunately, my partner is from Mexico City and his family lives there still, so that personal connection is immensely helpful,
Mm.
right? I don't really know how I would be able to have tackled those Mexico City archives otherwise. So I got fortunate, right? And I think
Hmm.
I was maybe less timorous than other scholars would have been in tackling this kind of project because I had the skills, I had the background and sort of the personal connections to do it, right? But then of course the third major challenge I think to doing this kind of work is it's a theoretical challenge and
Hmm.
there's a tendency I think or a danger in oversimplifying some of your comparisons, right? And that's where that kind of brings me back to my first point, where you really have to be an expert. I mean, it doesn't just dabbling in something or knowing the general history isn't sufficient, right? I
Hmm.
mean, you have to, in order to do a fruitful and productive comparative history, you need to allow for the nuances, right? The differences, like what exactly is similar, what is different, and why, right? Um, so yeah, it's those are all big challenges to doing this kind of work.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what your peer reviewer said, but I remember when Miss Duncan Campbell and I wrote our book, we got our one peer review back, and it was like, your comparisons are very interesting, but they might just be kind of coincidences.
Hmm.
And it was
Yeah.
it's sort of that you really need also sort of a press and reviewers who are kind of favorably minded to that kind of a project, I feel, when you do comparative.
Yes, yeah, and you need to make sure that your comparisons are are meaningful too,
Hmm.
right? I mean
Yes.
that there's an end point to it, right?
Yeah.
That you're able to sort of glean something
Hmm.
from those comparisons,
Yeah.
right? Um, is it significant that Texas seceded from both the US and Mexico? Yes, I
Hmm.
think it's more than incidental, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Mm.
those are the sorts of dangers or pitfalls of a project. Yeah, like this one.
And it, I guess when you started work on this, you probably didn't anticipate of what kind of a hot market you're getting into, because there have been a lot of books in the last 5 years on sort of Mexican, Texas, U.S. borderlands, primarily during the Civil War, kind of.
Mhm.
But how do you feel about entering that big a conversation with your book? Like, did you anticipate that you would go into such a like active field?
I kind of did just because as I was working on it and presenting at conferences, I was
Hmm.
meeting people, so
Yeah.
I kind of knew what was by osmosis, sort of what was circulating, right? And that
Hmm.
these ideas were circulating, and that this was sort of a cutting edge field that a lot of that was a lot of important work was coming out and was
Hmm.
going to be coming out, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's a little intimidating, but it's also really exciting.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean I've benefited immeasurably, right, from working closely with other folks. Erica Pani just had
Hmm.
a has an excellent book out that sort of covers the same period, some sort of similar
Hmm.
questions around constitutionalism and nation building. She's a tremendous mentor for me. It's also a very, Western history,
Hmm.
U.S.-Mexico borderlands history is a very welcoming field. And as I've found, I mean, there's some great mentors. Elliot West at the University of
Hmm.
Arkansas, immeasurably helpful, right, and supportive. And so I benefited from that as well. I think it's thrilling. I think it's exhilarating. I mean,
Hmm.
the last thing I would want to be doing is, be just doing something that I think is so niche and so
Hmm.
specific that I don't have anyone to talk to or to feed off of or to get ideas from or share them with. It would allow
Hmm.
me to monopolize a field. I mean, in some ways it might be more beneficial, but yeah, no, I
Hmm.
love having conversations like this around my book, like the one that we're having now, and with other folks. But you're right. I mean, the Civil War field, the field, your field, has
Hmm.
has also just there's been an explosion of work
Yeah.
on global history, and I think
Hmm.
it's much needed. I mean, I think the Civil War is an important event for U.S. history, but it was also, we're beginning to see an important event, globally. And there's been some really excellent work on these sort of comparative histories of the U.S. Civil War and many of them involving Mexico as well, and sort of how we sort of think about what the United States experienced and how exceptional it was.
Well, then I'm going to do the one bad thing that I probably shouldn't be doing, but I'm going to do it anyways. I want to see what your reaction is. Do you like, we have had so many books on the, say, 1850s to 1870s, US, Mexico.
Mhm.
Are we getting to the end?
I don't think so.
Yeah. I
I
was
don't
hoping
think
not.
so. Yeah, no, I think there's too many big questions that the Civil
Mm,
War tackles,
hmm.
that I think we've just scratched the surface of. I mean, I also think that, I mean, if there's one avenue in which the field can really move forward, I think that it's making our work comprehensible and significant to scholars in other countries.
Hmm.
I noticed, especially just in my time, in Mexico and talking to
Mm,
Mexican academics, like when I sort of proffered the idea that, the US and Mexico were weak in similar ways, and in fact that
mm.
there were things about Mexico that were even more appealing and viable than the United States, they kind of look at me like I'm crazy
Yeah.
because they're so used to thinking as many,
Hmm.
US scholars are of, well, Mexico was the
Right.
weaker country, the United States was stronger. Like
Yeah.
so I think that that's maybe the most fruitful sort of avenue for this to go, is to start actually engaging more actively with scholars abroad. I,
Hmm.
I just got back from UC Santa Barbara, and we're putting together with my dear friend and colleague Veronica Castillo Munoz, putting together a binational consortium of U.S. and Mexican scholars,
Nice.
librarians, archivists, artists, activists to try and facilitate research and intellectual exchange across the
Mm,
border. It's really the first organization of its kind, and we're trying to really, encourage because there's a lot of borderlands folks, people
hmm.
who both in the U.S. and Mexico who study topics that
Right.
would really benefit from doing research in the other
Hmm.
country, right?
Right.
And they don't do it, either because they don't have the training, they don't have the language capability, whatever,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's I think probably the new horizon
Mm,
for our field, I think. But I think, I mean, there's, as I said, there's so much about the Civil War. I mean, questions of sovereignty, questions of nationalism, questions of emancipation, of labor, um,
hmm.
that I think, there's a lot of fruitful comparison that
Hmm.
can come out
Yeah. Which leads us to the book, finally. And the long lists of topics that I pulled from it because it's so densely packed with information that you're weaving together in there. And I really feel like at the start of the book, the key part, and maybe something we should talk about here is how did people, especially on the frontiers, think of what it means to be a republic?
of. That's a great question. Yeah, it's a complicated one. I think that at least for the folks that I study, republicanism meant, for the most part, unobtrusive federal government,
Hmm.
strong state sovereignty,
Hmm.
um, uh, um, uh, and access to land and economic independence. In fact, if there was one task that the federal government had, or one obligation to its citizens that it had, I think it was to facilitate land acquisition
Hmm.
for white men, right? And so that I think is what republicanism meant for most of these folks.
Hmm. And as you kind of nicely point out, Mexico seemed more appealing to them.
That's correct. To some of them, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, which is counter to what a lot of people today would think.
Right.
So maybe explains that a little bit.
Yeah. So, at the time, in the late 1810s, early 1820s, the United States is experiencing a bit of a political and economic crisis, particularly in the West. We have the Panic of 1819, in which the central bank, overlent money, causing a huge bubble to burst in the West. Many people went into bankruptcy. And it created a lot of disillusionment with the United States and this sort of lingering suspicion of centralized government, right? Which is really present there from the beginning, right? From the ratification of the Constitution. And so you get a lot of hostility towards central government, a lot of disillusion with the United States, this fear that it was shifting more towards, tyranny. Not a lot of it is really founded, right? But it sort of taps into what I think is a long-standing anxiety that Americans have about political over-centralization, and a lack of access to land, right? Which has always been an issue, right? Ever since the 18th century. Meanwhile, Mexico is this new republic. It emerges out of centuries of Spanish monarchy. The entire world, anybody who knows about Mexico's independence is excited about it. I mean, this was sort of the capital of the Spanish Empire for a long time. It's known to have a lot of precious metals, a vast, diverse topography, right? Coasts on both sides, right? Lots of land. And Mexicans adopt a constitution that many early Americans find very appealing. It's a lot more like the Articles of Confederation than it is like the US Constitution, meaning that its commitment to state sovereignty is much stronger. It has three separate branches of government, but the legislative branch is actually superior to the other two branches, and that comes out of part of its, democratic impulses. And it has a lot of land, especially in the north, that it is eager to settle. And so all of these things sort of come together to attract a lot of folks, some of whom already had experience living under the Spanish Empire, right? During the 1790s, Spain, in fact, had a similar policy to attract US settlers, again, many of whom felt isolated and abandoned from the United States, and some of whom were even contemplating secession, right? If they, swore allegiance to the Spanish Empire and became essentially Spanish subjects, or at least aligned themselves with Spain. So yeah, New Spain and Mexico sort of have this tradition of sort of, drawing these settlers in and taking advantage of the weaknesses of the United States in the West.
Yeah, and it's you kind of as you were talking, I kind of saw it back because I think it was in Dan House's What God Has Wrought, where he starts with a comparison in 1815 of the United States and Mexico and how
Yep.
extraordinarily similar the two countries were in size, population,
Mhm.
and then totally diverging paths that they
Yeah.
take.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I now when you mention it, I remember that about he actually starts off in Mexico City, I think, sort of
Yeah.
looking north.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, but they have a I mean, they come out of very similar Republican. I mean, obviously, Mexico is it's long. It's a part of a European monarchy for a lot longer than the United States is. Um, and then it enters as an empire, right, for a few years. Um, but its constitution, in fact, embodies a lot of the principles that, for example, anti-federalists, right, particularly voiced during the framing, during the 1780s and 1790s. Its constitution is not modeled after the United States. This has long been assumed. It draws more on Hispanic constitutional tradition. But it's still part of this larger sort of Republican sort of ethos, right?
Hmm.
And it's I mean, a lot of the debates, the constitutional debates are very similar between the Mexican framers and the US framers, specifically over this question of sovereignty, right? Like how much power should the federal government have
Hmm.
versus how much power should the states have? But in Mexico, they embrace state sovereignty even more than they do in the United States. And that makes Mexico appealing to a lot of people, and there were many who had, concerns or grievances with the United States centralization, right? Particularly when it came to taxation and the militia service and control. So it's actually shouldn't be that surprising to us, I
Hmm.
think, that Americans were attracted to Mexico for that reason.
Yeah, and the other part when you talked about sort of sovereignty and sort of I guess we can call it sort of the fluidity of the Mississippi River Valley, Texas areas, so sort of this area that was Spanish for a while, Old French, kind of it,
Mhm.
region. It kind of took me back to Susan Stearns's book, Empire of Commerce, because I think in there she has this episode where, and I want to say it was Andrew Jackson goes down to Natchez and is like, "Oh yeah, I swear sovereignty to the Spanish to get land down here." Like it seemed so fluid and like I can move wherever. I just take on whatever's kind of identity I need to get the benefits out of it.
Yeah, I think that book starts with Jackson declaring declaring fealty to Spain. Yeah, and that this is actually not new, right? I mean, I
Hmm.
think that this is that whole region is so it has so many different political, it's occupied by, at least three different powers like
Hmm.
in like 30 years, right? And you have both white settlers and natives,
Hmm.
right? Like sort of playing these different powers off of each
Hmm.
other, forming different alliances and allegiances. I mean, it's a very flexible, sort of malleable political climate at this
Hmm.
time. And sort of what I learned is that, the package of ideas, right? Tommy Richards talks about this in his idea that republicanism, it's better to think of it during this time as sort of like a package of ideas
Mm,
that has to do with, state and local autonomy, land acquisition, right? Racial privilege,
mhm,
right? Than to think of it as associated with any one power, right? And I think that, I mean, there are some people who, found their ideas of republicanism more attainable in Mexico and even the Spanish
mhm.
Empire than they did the United States.
Yeah. And the other part too is that I kind of try to circle back. Like it feels weird circling back to your question after circling around it a little. But you mentioned state sovereignty being very powerful in Mexico, and one of the you spent a good number of pages on this because Texas initially is paired, and I don't want to butcher. I'll let you give me the correct pronunciation of this province. Like it's paired with a North Mexican province. And
Coahuila,
there's a
yeah.
lot of fighting over like we want our own sovereignty and not be like part of another state in Mexico.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions around because ultimately they do want to become their own state, but they don't have the population
Mhm.
to really merit it. And then by the time they do, Mexico is too sort of suspicious of these immigrants to allow them to.
Mhm.
Um, but. And then uh, there's a lot of sort of conflict and debate that they have with with the state government that they're
Mhm.
in, right, as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of these folks, I think the idea that, I mean, it's not just state sovereignty, but it's also sort of local autonomy, right? And I think
Mhm.
it's the fact that the federal government or any government really is so absent
Mhm.
in that region, right? And I think to them, those principles sort of mean that they can sort of establish their own sort of communities unhindered by really much government oversight at all, right? Whether it's state or federal.
I kind of feel like that sounds like an American Revolution
Right.
historian saying that, saying
Exactly.
Britain is so far away, we can do whatever we want in
Right.
Massachusetts or South Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was sort of the sentiment.
Yeah. And you're you're also like it maybe I was paying close attention to it, but I really noticed that you on a number of occasions sort of made correctives where you kind of were like when we talk about like Fredonia, sort of that early kind of challenge to Mexico, or like the way we think about Austin and the kind of his land grant, his role. Like it seemed like there were a number of moments where you kind of had that U.S. survey textbook in mind, and we're like, no, that what we're teaching you guys is not right. That's overly simplified.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I approached this project as a sort of definitely as a kind of corrective, not just for Texas I mean, especially for
Mm,
Texas history, but also for the way that we understand early
mm,
Mexico and the
yeah.
United States as well.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Fredonian Rebellion, I mean, it's long sort of been understood as this sort of like um, preface to the
mm,
Texas Rebellion, right? Like, and another example of sort of, early settlers' sort of restive sentiments. But I sort of saw it as really a time when Austin and his allies really were able to demonstrate their loyalty to Mexico. It's just, I mean, you see all of this I mean, they're the ones who ultimately suppressed the rebellion. And you see all of this language. To me, that was where it was actually the most poignant.
mm,
His ideas of Mexico is the only place where we can truly be American, I think is basically the paraphrase line that he says,
Incredible.
right?
It's
And
incredible.
yeah, yeah, it is. And I think it really speaks to, what we were just discussing before, which is that, Americanness or
Mm,
Republican, like these ideas are disconnected
hmm
from any specific nation state at this point, right? They're a collection of values, a collection of
hmm
ideas that people are pursuing.
Yeah.
And, if they can find it more readily in Mexico, then they'll go to Mexico, right?
hmm
Today, we tend to associate all of these things with a nation state, right?
hmm
But I think during this period, it's important to sort of understand that many of these folks didn't. I mean, they understood republicanism, American identity were disconnected from statehood.
Yeah. And I think that's the hardest part from sort of divorcing yourself from the moderns, that you can believe in something. It can be anywhere, in any form, in any shape, and
Mhm.
it's sort of like it's a fluidity, because it like one of the things that I wrote in my notes when I was reading your book, it was like it seemed like Jefferson agrarian vision is more readily achievable, and for many perceived at least, in Mexico than it is in the United States. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. Which doesn't make them less American. I mean, it doesn't,
no.
right? I mean, it doesn't make them less sort of, committed to the ideas or the ideals,
Hmm
right? And that they embody with American independence, right?
Yeah.
It's just that it's for them, it's transferable, right?
Yes.
When it comes to nation. Yeah.
Yeah, and like Austin, right? Like he goes to Mexico City, he tries to kind of
Hmm.
lobby for Texas at various stages. And at which point do you see, like it seemed like from my reading, and you can correct me on this, it seemed from my reading that when he goes to New Orleans and kind of has sort of interactions there, that he gets more independence minded, outwardly at
Um,
least.
Yeah, I I think that the New Orleans venture is, I think, kind of the nail in the coffin of
Okay.
his shift
hmm
because he goes back and forth. I mean, at
hmm
least from reading his papers, it appears that he's kind of shifting back and forth.
hmm
And the other thing too to note, I mean, that is that demographically Texas changes so much,
Okay.
right? Between the initial settlements in
Mm,
1821 and then 1835, in large part because Austin is so successful at
Mm-hmm.
recruiting more settlers, right?
Right.
But also the political situation in the US changes. Jackson
Mm-hmm.
gets elected, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jackson's election is very much a response to the very grievances that pushed a lot of these folks towards
Mm-hmm.
Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And for people like Austin and people of his generation, I mean, they kind of look at Jackson's election as like, whatever, right? I mean, they're Mexican by that point. But
Right.
for many more recent arrivals, I think, and for folks still in the United States who are pondering moving to Texas, they start to do it, I think, for more opportunistic reasons. I mean, you see far less of the sort of praising of Mexico and eagerness to become Mexican starting around 1830. So the demographic starts to change, and slowly but surely, Texas becomes dominated by folks whose ties to Mexico are weaker,
Mm-hmm.
who are less generally disillusioned with the United States. Um, and then meanwhile, in Mexico, like Mexico's commitment to federalism and its
Mm-hmm.
constitution also it becomes much less tenuous. I mean, you have this flirtation with centralism, you have, the law of April 6, 1830, right? So these things start to change and Mexico sort of becomes not the sort of like federalist promised land that it was before. And so that whole thing changes. And I think that Austin, even before he goes to New Orleans, he's aware that there's this sort of that the kind of the sustaining the kind of like firm commitment to Mexico might not be sustainable, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's something that he still wants, right? And might not even make sense.
Yeah.
But I think when he goes to New Orleans, and I think when he finds out that really the only way that he can recruit resources for the movement is to pitch it as an
Mm-hmm.
independence movement, then that's kind of, I think, the nail in the coffin for him.
Mm. Yeah. So I did like the line where you kind of said that he thinks of himself as Mexican, right? Because so many times when you read sort of the Texas based origin stories, or you read sort of these like the textbooks in US history, it's sort of like they go there and they always remain American. They don't adapt Catholicism. They bring their slaves. They kind of they just don't integrate into Mexican society. But you're saying no, they are integrating. They are making Texas and Mexico their new home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, part of the distinction that I want to make here, and I think I tried to sort of discuss it a little bit in the introduction,
Mm-hmm.
is that there is a difference between political loyalty
Mm-hmm.
and assimilation. Because a question that I got a lot of times as I was writing the book and presenting on it would be, well, how many of them learn Spanish? Like how many, Austin, by the way, actually did learn Spanish. She
Mm-hmm.
was completely fluent in it, and there were some other settlers too. Or how often did they marry
Mm-hmm.
Mexicans? And it's true that generally the assimilation was not great among the Texas settlers. You see more assimilation in California, interestingly. But I also would argue that that is not an indicator of their political loyalty to Mexico, right? Like these are two different things. And I think we do ourselves a real disservice when we tend to conflate the two. An individual can be very unassimilated to the dominant culture and still be firmly committed
Mm-hmm.
to their adopted country, right? Like those two things are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, I think, and did they continue to display symbols of of U.S. identity? Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that doesn't undermine their commitment to Mexico. I mean, you go to any immigrant neighborhood anywhere, and you will see symbols of people's original country,
Right.
right? Their
Yeah.
country of origin, and
Yeah.
that doesn't compromise their commitment, right? So what I'm arguing is that there is a political fealty here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that doesn't require that they be assimilated, and it doesn't require that they completely turn their backs on the United
Mm-hmm.
States, right? Um, so yeah.
No, excellent. And it we kind of been kind of going around it a little bit, but I think I want to take it more head on as a topic because you're one of the keys in your book is sort of as a sense of belonging, of identity, of nationalism. And so far, and I was really happy to see this in your book and kind of been forced to kind of rethink, I usually was under the impression that in Mexico, that sort of sense of what it means to be Mexican really emerges and becomes clear during the French military occupation
Mm.
in the 1860s. But you're suggesting that sort of the beginning and the sense of kind of how do we define Mexicanness emerges much sooner than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would absolutely say that the U.S. invasion of Mexico
Hmm.
uh, and the Mexican cession is
Hmm.
a critical defining point
Yeah.
for Mexican identity. Um, and of course, it predates the French
Hmm.
occupation. But I would say that I mean, if there's one sort of singular moment during the 19th century, the first sort of defining moment, I would say it's that. I mean, that's
Hmm.
that's when Mexicans sort of really start. I mean, really it starts. I mean, I think it dates back to the Texas
Hmm.
Rebellion and the
Yeah.
loss of Texas, right?
Hmm.
And Tornell, of course, is so central to this, right? That he's sort of basically, he's the first politician that I read who is really seems to assert a kind of specific Mexican identity in a sort of
Hmm.
coherent and articulate way. And he's a centralist, right? He's Santa
Hmm.
Anna's war minister, which I think is significant. And he basically is saying, that this is not this freedom-loving, liberty-loving
Hmm.
people at all, right?
Right.
This is a pro-slavery
Yeah.
a plot
Hmm.
to steal land first from Native Americans and now from Mexicans, right? And if there is if you know the Western world wants to prevent the spread of slavery, then you have to support Mexican sovereignty effectively, right? And we are against all of those things, right? We are against the theft of land, we're against slavery, we're
Mm,
against all of those things. And it's a bit simplified because obviously Mexico has its own tradition of racialized compulsive labor, and certainly Tornell is overlooking in those remarks. But nonetheless, I really think that first with Texas and then ultimately with the U.S. with the
mm,
war with the U.S. later, that's really I think when you start to see
mm,
a real sort of concrete sort of form of Mexican identity start to emerge. you know, Meanwhile, at a time when the United States has no, it's completely divided
mhm,
over all of these questions around, sovereignty, slavery, identity, and all of that,
mhm.
which is interesting.
Well, that's sort of where, like, I wanted to get to Tornell eventually, but since you opens the door, let's go through it and immediately talk about him because he's so fascinating and like seeing Mexico as the thing that everyone should imitate, right? Like I think that was sort of the lines he used in his in the works that you quote, and it's like it is so counter because usually during this time we're talking late 1840s scholars, like I'm thinking here, guys like Don Doyle and the
Mhm.
1848 kind of comparative group, they're all saying like, oh, everyone in the world looks to the United States and wants to imitate, and you're like saying, no, there are actually people that say you should imitate us and not them.
Yeah. Well, I would say that most folks in Latin America are not really saying that. I mean, Bolivar
Hmm.
similarly says like this, the United States model is inappropriate for
Hmm.
Latin America. And Tornell
Right.
says the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Like that this is not, it worked for them, but it's not going to work for
Hmm.
us,
Right.
right? We have a completely different imperial past, a completely different, relationship to religion and
Yeah.
all of these sorts of things. So I mean, and that's not to say, I mean, the liberals and the Federalists, many of them looked admiringly upon the United States,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But there is this very strong thread in Mexican
Hmm.
republicanism that is like, no, we can't borrow too heavily from them. That's
Hmm.
not necessarily the model that we want to imitate. But I think if there's any country that's positioned, right, to
Hmm.
highlight the limits of American democracy, it's Mexico, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're sitting right there on the border. They are victims of this pro-slavery vision, right, that's
Hmm.
being executed, right, beginning in the 1830s. And so yeah, I think he's really fascinating. And I think he's been kind of dismissed
Hmm.
cynically, I think, by historians in the past, but he's very, and he's also sort of the first person to sort of articulate this like modern idea of sovereignty
Hmm.
and democracy and majority. I mean, the Sandinistas are not Democrats at all, right? But he basically when people in the United States are looking at the Texas Rebellion and they're saying, "Oh, these freedom-loving Americans rebelling
Hmm.
against this vicious tyranny." Tornell is saying, no, that's
Hmm.
not what they're doing. And also, you can't just up and secede from a country. Like, you
Hmm.
can't, right? Like, this is an extreme minority faction
Hmm.
who, like, didn't want to accept the political direction that the country was
Hmm.
going in.
Right.
And, we're a nation and
Hmm.
we can't just have people breaking away willy-nilly. Like, that
Hmm.
impacts, us as well. And it's
Hmm.
interesting because it's exactly, I'm writing about this now for another project, but it's the exact same theory that
Hmm.
Lincoln later adopts towards the South, which
Yep.
is like, we are a sovereign nation.
Hmm.
Like, you cannot just secede because you don't like the political direction that
Yeah.
things are going in. There is a process for this,
Hmm.
and, unilateral secession is not it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just currently working on something with regard to Argentina, and that's exactly what Buenos Aires and Argentina are arguing. It's not like this is like it's everywhere in the Americas during this period.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating that we're it's t taking us this long to kind of see that, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, in let me think here. Yeah, let's go back to back really briefly because the you kind of have these moments now because the end of the war with Mexico, you kind of really interestingly foreshadows that this is sort of like leads both countries into very different directions. But both of them during the 18, let me get this straight here, 1830s are struggling with centralization efforts. And was this like you're juxtaposing Andrew Jackson with, and I need to look him up, Vicente
Guerrero.
Guerrero. So why did you feel that comparison was just sort of the what you needed to do there to kind of showcase how the two countries were developing?
Um, so for well, they're both elected the same year, I
Hmm.
believe. And they're both populists.
Hmm.
They're sort of both, and they both sort of assert this sort of direct relationship to the people, right? That
Hmm.
they are sort of the sovereign representative of the people. But they're also, I think, revealingly different, right? I mean, Jackson, of course, is, white supremacist, genocidal, right? Who wants
Yeah.
to take land and away from natives and distribute it to white settlers, right? Guerrero is, an Afro-Indian president who is also committed to making land more accessible to agrarians, but he wants to give it to, indigenous people, right? And so they embody they're very similar in
Hmm.
certain ways, but also different.
Hmm.
And so I felt like it was necessary to kind of highlight that.
Hmm.
Uh, because it showed what was similar about these nations and
Hmm.
also what was distinct
Hmm.
about them. And of course, they're both also just important to the overall sort of history that I'm writing because Jackson, as I mentioned before, he's elected, in response to many of the same grievances that drove these settlers, right? And I think that many of the people who come after his election are much more sympathetic to the United States, are
Hmm.
much more, identify much more with the United States as a
Hmm.
result of how things have shifted there. Meanwhile, Guerrero's emancipation decree is sort of the first source of major grievance and panic
Hmm.
in Texas, right? When they think, oh gosh, we can't bring our
Hmm.
slaves in now. What are we going to do, right? And revealingly, they end up leaning more on the 1824 Constitution and these ideas around local autonomy and state sovereignty to combat that. But it's the first time that it's his first sort of moment when there's actual sort of widespread panic in Texas and there's a sort of collision with centralist policies
Yeah.
or central government policies.
Yeah, and it's also sort of like it seems like a very inward looking, reflective attitude that some politicians in Mexico bring to this because they're kind of like, well, we're seeing this amount of instability in the country, and where have we erred, right? Where did we go wrong, and what should we do to improve the country?
Hmm. Hmm.
It
Hmm.
feels like Mexicans were better at that than the the
Um,
United States.
yeah, I mean, there was a lot more. Yes, in some ways they were. I mean, there was also a lot more political like instability, right, in
Yeah,
Mexico
yeah,
than there was in
yeah.
the United States. I mean, they kind of had to centralize, or else things were just gonna go to hell. But you're right. I mean, I mean, part of the thesis I think that I'm arguing is that it's Mexico's kind of weaknesses. I mean, that inherently, I mean, the very system that ends
Mm,
up attracting these people to Mexico is also the source of Mexican weakness, right? I mean,
mm,
it's a quote unquote strength, right, in the 1820s because it's attractive to these folks, but long term, it's not a strength, right? It's not a strength for Mexico. It's not a strength for the United States. And so, but part of what I'm trying to argue is that it was precisely Mexico's weaknesses, its
mhm,
vulnerabilities, right? Its decentralization, its ultimate loss of land, right?
mhm,
Its fiscal bankruptcy, all of those things that end up, I think, propelling it more swiftly towards this sort of vision of modern of a sovereign, viable nation, right? Meanwhile, in the United States, especially in the aftermath of the war, Americans are able to like just tick along with this
Mhm.
image of themselves as this strong, viable republic. Well, in the meantime, they're actually suffering from many of the same vulnerabilities that
Mhm.
Mexico has. But because they've experienced this, they have this well-funded military and they've
Mhm.
experienced this great military achievement, they're sort of able to delude themselves for
Mhm.
another 10 years into thinking that they're this, viable nation.
Yeah. And it's I mean, I guess in somewhat just crossed my mind as you were talking. I mean, on some levels, that kind of the victory in the war against Mexico and sort of the opening of more land, sort of hate to kind of go with Frederick Turner's kind of frontier ceases. It's sort of like it allows for the sort of that push westward, kind of keeping these issues bottled up a little bit longer than like
Yes.
I mean, we almost went there in 1850 with California's admission, but it's they kind of were able to kind of like, let's hold it together for a little bit more.
Yeah, and also, leaning on these ideas of sovereign, these competing idea of
Mm,
like popular sovereignty, right? Was
right.
like
Yeah.
supposed to be the solution to this thing. Like, let's just leave it to the settler communities to
Yeah.
like decide for themselves about slavery. And it's like,
Yeah.
nope, that won't work. Right? I
Not
mean,
long
maybe
term.
Kansas and it's just, it's whereas, by 1850, the Mexicans are like, we are done with
Mm.
dual sovereignty. Like we need a strong nation state. We need a strong military. We need all of these sorts of things
So
that we now
there is an
exist.
irony in that
Yeah.
because you're kind of and I agree that like the Mexican session is a huge factor in kind of fostering a rethinking of Mexicanness. But then you also rightly say that what really brings reform is a tiny bit of the Gadsden Purchase.
Oh, right. Right.
Because that
Oh,
brings
because
down
of
Santa Anna and
right.
starts sort of the process towards La Reforma.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think right. So the Gadsden Purchase is Santa Anna's sort of last effort to sell a portion
Hmm.
of Mexico to the United States. Yeah. And it shows just how by that point, I mean, Mexicans have had it in terms of losing territory to the United States. Like they're not, yeah, that was not a very wise move on his part. And it seals I mean, it's the end of his political
Mm.
career completely. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that, although I wouldn't represent Santana's decision to do that as in any way representative of
No.
Mexico. I mean, Mexico generally, Mexicans generally had rejected that idea. Um, uh, uh, but you're right that it does, it's sort of the final nail in the coffin that kind of triggers, right, this complete abandon, like, they basically scrap canvas and like start clean. Like that we're
Right.
done with dictatorships, we're done with this over centralization, and we're done with radical federalism.
Mm.
Now it's time to adopt a totally new sort
Right.
of political vision, which ultimately they do in 1857. Yeah.
Yeah. How like obviously there's a lot of detractors to the new vision of 57 because
Mhm.
Mexico goes into a civil war. So actually let me take a step there. I forget his book, the Habsburg on the Rio Grande. I don't remember who the author of that was. It's a recent book on
Hmm. Hmm.
Maximilian in Mexico. But
Hmm.
how would you think of this period? Do you think of like the kind of Reform War, Guerra de la Reform, as kind of continuing with sort of the French coming in and kind of helping the conservatives create the monarchy, or do you think of these two as separate kind of pieces?
Um, I think that I think that they're part of the same story.
Hmm.
I think that um Well, I don't, I mean, yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's, no, I would argue that they're part of the same story. I mean, I think in many ways it's kind of, the French occupation is kind of like, is sort of is another manifestation, I think, of this sort of competition between Mexican federalists and
Hmm.
centralists that I think dates back,
Hmm.
because centralists are arguing for a long time that it's really Europe that we should be looking towards.
Hmm.
Um, and this is a refrain that, a lot of conservative Mexican Republicans make, actually,
Right.
is that we should be modeling ourselves sort of after these European monarchies, even if they're Republican. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's a better model for us than that. We need centralization. We need
Hmm.
some top-down authority. We need the imposition of order and stability, right? And I think that that's much the same sort of impetus
Hmm.
that compels, a group of Mexicans to
Hmm.
invite basically to invite the French in. I think that book does a good job of recasting that period as rooted in
Hmm.
Mexican politics and
Right.
transition. I think that for far too long we've sort of seen it as this like weird, anomalous,
Hmm.
like, moment of like Europe reimposing
Hmm.
itself on the Western Hemisphere, which it was to an extent. But I also think that it was rooted in the same sorts of political debates and discussions that had characterized
Right.
Mexico for decades.
And I was just thinking here because there's an irony in all of it, right? Because like the United States offers to prevent that intervention by the Europeans for the debt collection there in Veracruz, 61, if Mexico signs over land, right? It's like it,
Well, and it reveals the ignorance of the United States at that point, because part
yes.
of the part of the reason why they welcome France is like, this will be our opportunity to finally
Hmm.
like, get the US off our back and
Yeah.
stop, right? And like stop,
Yeah.
having to cede land to them, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's rooted in the very grievances that Mexico had had with the United States since
Right.
the 1830s, and the
Right.
anxiety and the sense of like, oh gosh, we have to
Hmm.
align ourselves with some other powerful European empire lest we lose more land and basically lose our entire nationhood.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And how then does the like the reforms, or I guess we could like the plan of Ayatla? Is that
Ayutla.
how you
Uh-huh.
Ayutla? Okay, good. I'm learning Mexican Spanish today. Ayatla. How does that really kind of represent sort of lessons learned, changes brought, and like from both sides, right? Like from the Mexican perspective of like what did we do wrong in the past, but then also what did our neighbors to the north do right and wrong that we might want to kind of think about not doing or cautiously taking into consideration.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that question. So from my perspective, and I sort of tried to make this in the last couple chapters of the book
Mhm.
clear, is that the Revolution of Ayutla and the 1857 Constitution in Mexico, to me, come out of the same impulses
Mhm.
and embody many of the same ideas that Reconstruction does, right?
Mhm.
Which is basically, both countries become sort of new reborn republics or
Mhm.
nations, really. They're not republics anymore. Committed to these ideas of equality,
Mhm.
democracy, and liberty, right? And that the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the entire Mexican 1857 Constitution are really sort
Mhm.
of committed to, right? Now, they wouldn't, at this point, it's largely rhetorical, right? And there are many problems with the Reconstruction Amendments, and there are many
Mhm.
problems with the
Right.
Constitution, but they're definitely rooted in this new conceptualization
Mhm.
of the scope and purpose of federal
Mhm.
power. What is this nation about? What are we trying to do here? How much do we have to reform ourselves? And, this idea that we need to, if we're going to secure our nation, and I think that this is the main sort of departure that we begin to see. is that we really have to expand democracy
Hmm.
to as many people as we can. And I think that that represents a clear departure from how republicanism in both countries was viewed before
Hmm.
that, which I think was more about equating national security with limits on democracy. That if we expand too much democracy too fast, it creates chaos and disruption and disunion, and that starts to change for both countries.
Hmm.
And many of those reforms are like they're very similar. Like Mexico, and it had already been an anti-slavery republic, but they formalize it in that document. They have universal manhood suffrage. They also adopt birthright citizenship, which I think
Hmm.
is crucial, both countries at around the same time.
Hmm.
Again, which I think is rooted in this desire to expand democracy
Hmm.
and secure the nation state by doing so. So I find it somewhat surprising that and I think there's a lot of work there to do and from a sort of
Hmm.
comparative constitutional framework. And I'm working on a piece right now that sort of reconsiders that 1857 Constitution in comparison to the Reconstruction Amendments and sort of,
Ooh.
is trying to sort of argue, was this another constitutional revolution in Mexico? And it's interesting because in the conference that I just came from, where I was sort of sharing this idea with some Mexican historians,
Mm.
they were like, they were like, that's interesting, 1857. They're like, that's not, we wouldn't consider that the major constitutional rebirth. They're like, 1917
Right.
was.
After the end of the
And it's so
Porfiriato.
interesting. Of course.
Yeah.
And of course it was. I mean, of course
Yeah.
1917 was revolutionary, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because there's a whole body of scholars in the
Mm.
US who look at Reconstruction as
Hmm.
this revolutionary, redefining
Right.
moment for the United States. And
Hmm.
how interesting it is that Mexicans don't with the
Mm.
1857, even though they're
Right.
basically saying the same thing, they're rooted
Mm.
in the same sort of sets of
Right.
ideas. So again, it's just sort of like an interesting
Mm.
point of comparison.
No, I'll have you back when you finish that article.
Okay.
Because I want to hear about that and want to talk about that. That sounds
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah,
And you're
definitely.
right, because as you were talking, I kind of was thinking of like you there is a lot of similarity during this period because you have sort of I guess the first part here should be that you're very clearly outlining that the individuals who were sort of Republican thinkers at the start of your book in 1820, they they've gone. And what is a Republican thinker by 1865 is a very different has a very different base than it had 40 years earlier. So there's sort of an intellectual change that has happened to what does it mean to be a Republican?
Yes. Yeah, much of which requires rejecting you know, a lot of the framing, a lot of this core ideas, right?
Yeah.
Ideas that had framed the sort of earlier generation of Republicans,
Yeah.
right? Specifically, this commitment to divided sovereignty, right?
Hmm.
Now, of course, we still have, both republics still, but we have much stronger federal governments, right? There's a
Right.
much the need for a direct relationship between citizen
Hmm.
and the federal government.
Yeah.
Because I think what both republics learn, I mean, especially the United States, is
Mm.
that, and I also argue this in the book, is that by the 1830s, state sovereignty has become sort of the tool of slaveholders in the
Right.
South. I mean,
Yeah.
it's rooted. I mean, it has its own parallel political trajectory that is not necessarily
Right.
tied to slavery, but by 1830s, the two are connected, right? And slaveholders are drawing on these theories of divided
Hmm.
sovereignty and state power to protect their institution from federal intrusion, right? At least domestically. It's a totally
Hmm.
different story internationally. But even though many of the framers, and even though I think we tend to today to equate state sovereignty with democracy, it's actually, by the 1830s, it's hindered democracy,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, just as much. And certainly did in the United States,
Hmm.
by the mid 19th century. So it has to get discarded, or at least, I mean,
Hmm.
not discarded, but I mean, moderated to
Right.
in some way in order to have these sort of sovereign democratic nations.
Yeah. And then the other part that I was thinking about too is like it we have, and I'm a big fan of Enrico de Lagros's work with regard to sort of like comparative history, and he has done like a comparison between I think it's Lincoln and uh God, I think it's Mazzini. No, it's Garrison and Mazzini as sort of a comparison, and there's a number of people who are infatuated with sort of Garibaldi and the kind of
Mhm.
Garibaldi studies, and which drives me crazy every time a book comes out and like, oh, Garibaldi again. Ah, there he is. But it seems like a very fruitful comparison would be Lincoln and Juarez.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the Juarez government is, I mean, as soon before Lincoln even takes his inaugural oath,
Hmm.
Juarez is recruit. I mean, they're recruiting him, right,
Right.
to
Yeah.
support him in the conflict with the French, which they're, Americans are the United States is kind of reticent to do, at least initially. But yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, they're coming out of the same sort of political milieu, the same sort of philosophical ideas
Mhm.
around equality, around democracy, and around nationhood. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also kind of the kind of change of thinking that you have talked about, where it's like, yes, they're embracing sort of like manhood suffrage, and they're embracing sort of that role of I'm the leader of my country in a vast and devastating civil war.
Hmm.
And at the very same time, there's constitutions that I should adhere, but there's constitutional niceties that I cannot adhere to. Like in Juarez's case, right? That he's supposed to run for re-election, which in considering he's up there in Chihuahua province, bottled up
Hmm.
in a tiny part of Mexico, he can't. Or Lincoln that he's reducing the writ of habeas corpus because
Hmm.
he has to deal with sort of the resistance internally.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, they're testing the limits of executive power, right?
Hmm.
As you put it. Yeah. Yeah, they're functioning in a time of war. They're testing the limits of their own executive power, right? So yeah, there's a lot of room for comparison there. Yeah, yeah.
How would you think of the two countries as like both of them are going towards modern nationhoods? What separates them?
Um, that's a good question. I think one of well, there's two. I would point to two big factors. The first one is the role of the church in Mexico, right?
Hmm.
It's certainly not there in the United States, right? And it's uh, this sort of thing that they have to kind of reckon with. Mexico remains formally a Catholic country, right? Where you can't publicly practice another faith, right? For well into the 19th century, right? And even the 1857, even the Ayutla revolutionists struggle with that, right? And are reticent about taking religious tolerance as far as many of them would like to as a result of that. Um, the other big difference, I think, is the presence of slavery, right? And there's
Mm.
been some good work. I mean, Andres Resendez's work, right, sort of actually trying to sort of challenge that distinction, right, and
Hmm.
saying, well, Mexico actually had this, a whole, its own system of racialized
Right.
compulsive labor, but it wasn't codified in the same way that
Mm.
slavery was, and it wasn't. A driving force of national politics in
Hmm.
the way that slavery was in the United States. The major rift that you have in Mexico, is really one between Federalists and Centralists during this period, whereas in the United States, it's one, between the free states and the slave states.
So
And
wouldn't that also be sort of a federalist versus centralist?
Yes, well, it is. I mean, as we were just
Yeah.
discussing. I mean,
Yeah.
it is, but it's not
Yeah.
the defining
Yeah.
division, right? I
Yeah.
mean, at the end of the day, like slaveholders are perfectly willing to abandon state sovereignty,
Mm.
right, with the Fugitive Slave Act, as
Mm.
long as it serves slavery, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
their main motivation is slavery. So that's a distinction.
Well, I need to write that down because that just gave me an idea for my own project now. Um, so your book is like that. This is my bad because I'm sometimes with uh, kids I came last year and the new jobs that I got last year. I'm a little behind sometimes on some of the
Mhm.
newer literature. Your book has been out for a year. Was there anything like, have there been reviews, anything that surprised you where historians were a little critical of your work? I'm kind of
Um,
curious. Like,
yeah, not particularly. I mean,
yeah,
I
they should.
most of well, most of the criticisms I was already aware of.
Right.
So I had been aware of them and I had accepted them. The reviews have been generally good. And I'm particularly pleased, I think, with how Latin Americanists, how Mexicanists have received it. That
Nice.
was really, I was the most nervous about that. I mean,
Hmm. I can
because as
see
I said,
that.
I arrived to the field, as a graduate student, and I'm largely, I trained myself in the historiography and history of early Mexico. But I'm really delighted that they
Hmm.
found it helpful.
Okay.
Even if they're greeting some of my arguments skeptically. To me, that's just exciting. To me, that's just, that's just more opportunity to explore and dive into that. So yeah.
I always think of like when somebody criticizes, like, writes a book,
Yeah.
like if you didn't like that in mine, write your own book
Right,
about
right.
it. So, but you're also, and again, I'm glad that the book has had a good reception because it is such a, again, a really interesting work that takes us in new directions to think about how the United States and Mexico um, aligned and misaligned intellectually during this very crucial period of early nationhood. Early
Mhm.
nationhood, yeah, that's a great word choice there. Now, you're writing it during periods that, and this is not just the last 4 years or last 2 years, that the Mexican borderland has been a very contested space.
Mhm.
And where, and this is also not a new thing, that a lot of people in the United States look down on Mexico and Mexicans and Mexicanness. And what sort of do you feel would you like readers to take away? What would be something where you feel your book could really help us overcome some of that animosity, maybe?
Um, I think that I think that well, first of all, um, I think the idea of viewing, white male U.S. citizens who wanted to leave the United States for Mexico and become Mexican citizens, I think
Hmm.
is enlightening, right? There's this
Yeah.
idea that the United States has always been the destination of immigrants from around the world, which of course
Yes.
is completely wrong, right?
Hmm.
And I think the idea of disillusion with it's interesting because I think the
Hmm.
idea of disillusionment with the United States, I think would resonate with many people. I think many people are feeling across the political spectrum, feel like our institutions are our vulnerabilities are being exposed, right?
Hmm.
We are becoming, probably as divided as we've been, maybe perhaps since the Civil War, right? That there are all of these sorts of factors. But
Hmm.
I think seeing Mexico as this kind of viable
Hmm.
political option for folks who, should have been more American, should have been more committed to the United States than anybody, I think is new, and also sort of pointing to the fact that our histories are shared, that this is not, the borderlands are so important because it's literally where these countries overlap, right? And I think, and how each influenced the other, right? And that there wasn't always a clear border. There wasn't a border at all for a long time, right? And so I think sort of seeing that, I think is helpful.
Hmm.
Um, um, yeah, and I also think, contributing, I think in general, to challenging the idea that the United States has just always been this beacon of liberty and democracy, right? I mean, that's something that American historians have been, that's a war we've been fighting for a long time and probably
Hmm.
will continue to fight. So, yeah.
If you had not said it, I would have asked you that question. Because I was hoping you would say that exact thing, because it feels like especially that Civil War period transnational scholarship very often kind of falls into that exact trap that you just said. That sort of like the Civil War needs to safeguard that beacon of democracy for the world kind of person,
Mhm.
that aura that is still there in a lot of the scholarship, even though, like you point out, like I point out, like a few others point out, it's not that way. Like there's
Right.
a lot more conversation during this period and seeing the United States as that beacon that
Mhm.
enlightens the world.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Well, at this stage, I have taken up, well, with our pre-conversation, an hour and 40 minutes of your time, and you probably have things that you want to do on your nice Saturday in early November in Florida, probably including the beach.
Probably.
And I have a family thing I need to go to, so I very much appreciate that you took so much of your time today and talk to me and to my listeners about your really interesting book, which I will remind everyone is One National Family: Texas, Mexico, and the Making of the Modern United States from Johns Hopkins University Press.
Well, it was my pleasure. I'm delighted to have done this. This was one of the most thorough discussions of my book I think I've had since I published it. So,
Ooh, well, I take that compliment.
yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.